Every morning, your dog watches you leave. He's standing at the door, and you tell yourself he'll be fine. He'll probably just curl up and sleep. Dogs rest 14 hours a day anyway. He's okay. That's what most owners believe. But behavioral science tells a completely different story. What happens inside your dog after that door closes is not rest. Scientists have measured it in real homes, tracking cortisol, heart rate, and behavior, hour by hour, across thousands of dogs. What they found will change everything you thought you knew about your dog's day alone. And most owners misread every single sign. There is a hormone your dog cannot hide. It shows up in their saliva, their urine, and their blood. It is called cortisol. When researchers started measuring it in dogs left alone for hours, the results surprised everyone involved. A study out of Stockholm University tracked cortisol levels in dogs at regular intervals across an 8-hour separation period. The sharpest spike happened in the first 30 minutes. Not at hour 6. Not at hour 8. Right at the beginning. After that early surge, cortisol leveled off for most dogs. A strange, restless kind of stillness settled in for a while. Then, around the 3rd or 4th hour, it started climbing again. Slower this time, but steady. And it did not stop. By hour 6, cortisol in isolated dogs was measurably higher than in dogs who had human contact throughout the day. By hour 8, the body had been running a low-grade stress response for most of a full waking day. And here is what most owners do not know. Cortisol does not reset the moment you walk back through the door. Research shows it can take up to an hour after reunion for cortisol to return to baseline. The stress outlasts the absence. The tail wagging when you get home is not evidence of a calm day. It is a nervous system finally exhaling. But cortisol does more than change mood. At chronically elevated levels, it disrupts digestion, suppresses immune function, and changes how memory forms. In dogs, prolonged cortisol elevation has been linked to increased reactivity, disrupted sleep, and shifts in appetite and energy. Some dogs show all of this loudly. Others show none of it on the surface. But their biology does not lie either way. This is what researchers call suppressed stress. The dog has learned that distress brings no relief, so they stop showing it outwardly. Suppressed stress is not the absence of suffering. It is suffering that has learned to stay quiet. And it is the easiest kind to miss. Dogs who experienced repeated long separations over time showed higher baseline cortisol even on days their owners stayed home all day. The nervous system stopped expecting company. It adjusted its default to alone. That is an adaptation, not a behavior problem. Understanding that difference changes everything about how you read what your dog is doing when you finally return each evening. But cortisol is only part of the picture. The deeper question is why some dogs reach that threshold faster than others. And the answer has almost nothing to do with how long you are gone. It has everything to do with something else entirely. Your dog does not experience time the way you do. There is no clock on the wall that means anything to them. What your dog processes instead is rhythm, routine, the emotional texture of how their day has always unfolded when you are gone. Neuroscientists studying canine cognition describe this as temporal emotional mapping, not a clock, but a felt sense of sequence. When that sequence is consistent, the nervous system can anticipate. And anticipation, even of absence, is fundamentally different from uncertainty. In a study comparing two groups of dogs left alone for the same number of hours, researchers changed one variable only. One group had a consistent departure routine, the same sounds, the same signals, the same timing every single morning. The other group experienced unpredictable departures. Sometimes early, sometimes late, sometimes with a long goodbye, sometimes with nothing at all. Same hours of separation. The cortisol profiles looked nothing alike. The unpredictable group showed significantly higher stress throughout the entire day. It is not the hours. It is the uncertainty. 8 hours of rhythm is not the same as 4 hours of confusion. Think about what that means for your dog. You might be cutting your workday short out of guilt, rushing home early. But if your schedule is erratic, some days 6 hours and some days 10, with no consistent pattern, the shorter days may not help as much. Because your dog is not counting the hours. They are reading the environment for cues about what comes next. Departure cues are particularly powerful. The jingle of keys, the specific shoes you wear, the change in your voice before you go. Dogs can begin showing elevated heart rate up to 20 minutes before their owner actually leaves, just from reading those departure cues. For a dog with no consistent routine, every sequence of events that resembles leaving becomes a potential trigger. All day long. A drawer opening, a jacket pulled from a hook, your phone going silent. These are not neutral events for an unpredictable dog. Now think about the opposite. A dog who has heard the same sounds every morning for 3 years without exception. The alarm at 7. The coffee. The specific creak of the bedroom door. The same quiet goodbye every single time. That dog's nervous system has built a map. It knows what follows what. And knowledge, even of being alone, is calming. This is why 2 dogs left alone for identical hours can have profoundly different experiences of the same empty room. One is waiting. The other is managing uncertainty. Those are not the same thing neurologically, emotionally, or biologically. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the way dogs manage this uncertainty doesn't look the same across all dogs. What you see on the surface or don't see depends almost entirely on the individual animal in front of you. There is a type of dog that lets you know. You come home to a chewed chair leg, a scratched door, a mess. You feel frustrated, maybe embarrassed if the neighbor mentioned the barking. But this dog is actually the easier one to read. The anxious, vocal dog, the one who paces, cries, destroys things, is a nervous system that has not learned to suppress its signals. Separation anxiety in its active form is distressing to witness. But it is also honest. The dog is clearly telling you something. The behavior is not defiance. It is not spite. It is a threat response system that was never designed for 8 hours of silence. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, fires the same way it would near a predator. The body does not know the difference. For these dogs, intervention is usually clear. The behavior is visible. It asks for attention. And it tends to eventually get a response. But there is another type. And this is the one that most owners never catch. The shutdown dog. The one who, when left alone, simply goes still. No barking. No destruction. No visible distress at all. They lie by the door and wait. They do not eat the food left out. They do not explore. They simply exist. Owners of shutdown dogs often say they have the easiest, most well-behaved pet. And they mean it genuinely as a compliment. Behavioral researchers call this learned helplessness. The dog has stopped signaling because signaling never changed anything. So it stopped trying. Cortisol measurements in shutdown dogs are often just as elevated as in the vocal, destructive ones. Sometimes the numbers run even higher. The dog is not calm. The dog has learned that calm is the only option available. Those are not the same thing at all. This is the sign most owners mistake for good behavior. Stillness is not always peace. Sometimes it is a kind of giving up. And then there is a third category. The genuinely resilient dog. The one who, biologically and temperamentally, handles solitude with relative ease. These dogs exist. They are not a myth. And they tend to share a specific set of characteristics you can actually observe. They settle quickly after departure. Cortisol drops within the first hour. They engage with enrichment left out for them. They eat normally. They sleep in different spots rather than anchoring to the door. Their body language on reunion is relaxed. Resilience in dogs is not random. It is built. It comes from consistent routines, secure attachment, and an environment that makes sense. You can move a dog toward resilience. It takes time and consistency, but the biology responds. The nervous system can reorganize. But the first step is knowing which category your dog actually falls into, not which one you hope they are in. Most owners assume their dog is in the third category because they don't see obvious distress. And that assumption costs the dog something. So, ask yourself this. Does your dog eat while you are gone? Does your dog sleep away from the front door? Does your dog greet you with calm excitement, a wag, and then back to normal, rather than frantic, prolonged relief? If the answers are yes, you likely have a resilient dog. If even one answer is no, the next part matters for you. None of this is meant to make you feel guilty. That is the last thing this video is trying to do. Most dogs with working owners are not suffering in the way the worst-case headlines suggest. But some are. And the difference is manageable. The research doesn't conclude that you need to quit your job or hire a full-time sitter. It concludes something far simpler. What your dog needs most is not more of your time. It is more predictability inside the time they already have. The first thing you can do, starting tomorrow, is build a departure routine and hold it consistent every single day. Same alarm, same sounds, same goodbye. Not dramatic, not long emotional farewells that raise anticipatory anxiety, just consistent. Every time. Research shows that dogs with a predictable departure routine show lower cortisol spikes in that critical first 30-minute window. The second thing, environmental enrichment placed strategically in the hours that correspond to your dog's peak cortisol window. Not just a toy left on the floor. Something that requires engagement, a puzzle feeder, a frozen enrichment item, a scent game. This is not a distraction. This is a biological intervention. Engagement activates the prefrontal cortex and dampens amygdala firing in real time. The third thing is the hardest. Honest observation. Watch your dog on a camera for one full day if you can. Are they eating? Are they moving around the house? Or are they anchored to the door for hours, completely still and waiting? What you see in that footage may surprise you, and it will tell you more than anything else ever could. For most dogs, these three adjustments, predictable departure, timed enrichment, honest observation, will meaningfully change what their day actually feels like. For some dogs, what you see will point towards something that needs more than routine. And that is worth knowing too. Professional help for separation distress is available and effective. It is not a last resort. It is simply the next right step. You are not failing your dog by needing to work. You are doing what every thoughtful owner does, trying to understand. Remember the door. That image you carry with you every morning. Your dog standing there, watching you leave. You now know what that moment costs them biologically. And you know that the cost varies, and that it can be reduced. You were never the problem. You just didn't have the full picture. Now you do. If this changed how you see your dog's day, subscribe to this channel. New videos every week on the science behind the bond. Drop a comment below. Does your dog wait by the door when you leave? I want to know what you have noticed. And if you want to understand why your dog stares at you the moment you get home, that is the next video. The science behind that stare is older than you think, and it reaches back further than any of us expected.